Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce the Herpes Zoster session. The Zoster work group has been highly engaged and productive over the past 2.5 years as we've been preparing for the introduction of a new Zoster vaccine. This slide shows the current work group members, and I'd like to acknowledge Kelly Moore and Grace Lee as the other ACIP members on the work group, as well as Paula Auger, Jeff Cohn, and Jeff Kellman as ex officio members. A number of liaison representatives, as you can see on the screen, and invited consultants bringing a high level of expertise to this topic. And in particular, our CDC liaisons, Rafael Harpaz and Kathleen Dooling, who have been conducting the orchestra over the past couple of years. So the work group has been actively and frequently meeting since January 15. We've had 34 conference calls, presentations by manufacturers and investigators. We've considered the body of evidence regarding both safety and efficacy and other considerations for both vaccines, and have identified key zoster vaccine policy questions and discussed options. And as I'm sure you are aware, last week on October 20th, the FDA licensed the Shingrix vaccine, Herpes Zoster subunit vaccine by GSK for immunocompetent adults age 50 and up. And that will be the focus of the discussion today. However, I would also point out the work group will be continuing to meet in the future, and Zoster will continue to be on the agenda for future ACIP meetings. Both HZSU and an investigational vaccine by Merck are currently under evaluation for use in immune-compromised populations. And as more data becomes available regarding the safety and efficacy of these vaccines in immune-compromised individuals, that will come back to ACIP for further consideration. But the discussion today will focus on immunocompetent individuals. There have been a number of presentations to ACIP on this topic already in preparation for the discussion today, including presentations on general epidemiology, the efficacy and safety of the subunit vaccine, the effectiveness of the live vaccine, the grade results for both vaccines, immunogenicity results for a longer period of time for HZSU, and cost-effectiveness analyses. So this leads us at this point then to 3 policy questions that the work group has defined for input from ACIP. Question 1 is, should ACIP recommend HZSU for vaccination of immunocompetent adults 50 years and older? The second question is, should ACIP recommend HZSU for individuals previously vaccinated with Zoster vaccine live? And the third question today is, should ACIP recommend HZSU preferentially over Zoster vaccine live? And I'd just like to really acknowledge the hard work of all the members on the work group and other CDC contributors who have assisted the work group, and in particular our liaison support folks at CDC, Kathleen Dooling, Rafael Harpaz, and Angela Gua. And the first presentation will be by Angela, and she's going to review the grade analysis, and then that will be followed by presentations on cost effectiveness, and then an overview on considerations prior to the vote leading into the discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Angela Gua, and I'm with the Division of Viral Diseases. This presentation will be a summary of the grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation, or GRADE, of the Herpes Zoster vaccines. 2 separate grade assessments were performed for the existing Herpes Zoster vaccines, the newly licensed Herpes Zoster subunit vaccine, referred hereafter as HZSU, and the currently licensed and recommended live attenuated Herpes Zoster vaccine, referred hereafter as Zoster Vaccine Live, or ZVL. The results of these grade analyses were presented to ACIP on February 22, 2017, and June 21, 2018, respectively. Briefly, here is a recap of the steps of the grade process that were executed by the Herpes Zoster work group and that will be reviewed here today. Developing policy questions, considering critical outcomes, reviewing and summarizing evidence of benefits and harms, and evaluating quality of evidence. For both grade analyses, the work group deemed the prevention of herpes zoster and postherpetic neuralgia, or PHN, as critical outcomes. Duration of protection was considered important. For harms, serious adverse events were deemed critical and reactogenicity important. So now I'll talk specifically about the results from the grade of the herpes zoster subunit vaccine. The policy question for consideration is, should the herpes zoster subunit vaccine be routinely used to prevent herpes zoster? A systematic review of the literature was conducted to find articles in which the population of interest was immunocompetent adults aged 50 years and older. The intervention of interest is a 2-dose series of HCSU administered intramuscularly at 0 and 2 months, and the intervention was compared to placebo or no vaccine. 10 studies met inclusion criteria and were included in the grade analysis. The estimates of effect for benefits of HCSU include vaccine efficacy against herpes zoster and PHN, and duration of protection against herpes zoster, of which only data up to 4 years post-vaccination was available. All of the following estimates of efficacy come from 2 phase 3 clinical trials. Vaccine efficacy against herpes zoster for HCSU is 96.6% in adults age 50 to 59, 97.4% in adults age 60 to 69, 91.3% in adults age 70 to 79, and 91.4% in adults age 80 years and older. Vaccine efficacy against postherpetic neuralgia was reported to be 91.2% in adults age 50 years and older, and 88.8% in adults age 70 years and older. Vaccine efficacy against herpes zoster remained at or above 85% 4 or more years post-vaccination in all age groups. The harms outcomes included in the assessment were serious adverse events and reactogenicity. Based on estimates from the phase 3 clinical trials, there was no imbalance of serious adverse events between vaccine and placebo groups, and no reported serious adverse event related to vaccination. Grade 3 reactions, or reactions deemed to prevent normal daily activities, were more commonly reported in vaccinated groups compared to placebo. Any grade 3 reaction was noted in 16.5% of the vaccinated group compared to 3.1% of the placebo group. Grade 3 injection site reactions were reported in 9.4% of the vaccinated group compared to 0.3% of the placebo group. And grade 3 systemic reactions were reported in 10.8% of the vaccinated group compared to 2.4% of the placebo group. 7 additional studies assessed safety and reactogenicity of HCSU and found no serious adverse events related to vaccination, and found similar rates of reactogenicity as reported above. Here is the grade summary table for this analysis. The critical outcomes of herpes zoster, PHN, and serious adverse events are all supported by at least one good quality, large randomized control trial. The overall evidence type supporting the critical outcomes is 1, with evidence type 1 being the highest level of evidence and evidence type 4 being the lowest. In other words, our level of certainty of the estimates of effect of these outcomes is high. For important outcomes, the evidence types for reactogenicity and duration of protection were both 1. In summary, the findings were that herpes zoster subunit vaccine is significantly efficacious in preventing herpes zoster and PHN up to 4 years post-vaccination. No safety concerns of serious adverse events related to the vaccine were observed in clinical trials. However, grade 3 reactions were more commonly reported among vaccine recipients. So now I'll talk specifically about the results from the grade of the live attenuated herpes zoster vaccine. The policy question for consideration is the live attenuated herpes zoster vaccine safe and effective at preventing herpes zoster? A systematic review of the literature was conducted to find articles in which the population of interest is immunocompetent adults aged 50 and older. The intervention of interest is 1 dose of the live attenuated zoster vaccine, and the intervention is compared to placebo or no vaccine. 40 studies met inclusion criteria and were included in the grade analysis. The estimates of effect for benefits of zoster vaccine live include vaccine efficacy or effectiveness against herpes zoster and PHN, and duration of protection against herpes zoster, defined as VE 4 or more years post-vaccination. Based on clinical trial data, vaccine efficacy against herpes zoster for zoster vaccine live is 70% in adults age 50 to 59, 64% in adults aged 60 to 69, 41% in adults aged 70 to 79, and 18% in adults aged 80 years and older. Vaccine effectiveness from observational studies in adults aged 60 years and older ranged from 33 to 51%. In clinical trials, vaccine efficacy against PHN was reported to be 65.7% in adults aged 60 to 69 and 66.8% in adults aged 70 years and older. In observational studies, VE in adults 60 years and older ranged from 40 to 69%. Zoster vaccine live protection wanes year by year. All studies estimated a VE against herpes zoster of 40% or less 4 or more years post-vaccination. Now for estimates of effect for the harms outcomes, starting with serious adverse events. In 8 placebo-controlled randomized trials with over 36,000 participants receiving zoster vaccine live, there were no imbalances in serious adverse events between vaccine and placebo groups. An additional 20 studies with no comparison groups also found no serious adverse events associated with zoster vaccine live. For reactogenicity, injection site reactions were the most common reaction reported. In phase 3 clinical trials, 48% of vaccine recipients reported injection site reactions compared to 17% among placebo. Similar rates were reported in other clinical studies. The majority of injection site reactions were mild. 4 studies reported grade 3 injection site reactions that range between 0 to 4% of vaccine recipients. 7 studies reported any systemic adverse event, with reactions reported among 0 to 8% of vaccine recipients. Also of note, there were several cases of VZV rash caused by OCA Merck vaccine strain that were reported in clinical trials and in Merck's 10-year post-marketing review. Here's a grade summary table for this analysis. The critical outcomes of herpes zoster, PHN, and serious adverse events are all supported by at least one good quality large randomized controlled trial. The overall evidence type supporting these critical outcomes is 1. In other words, our level of certainty in the estimate of effect of these outcomes is high. Important outcomes of reactogenicity and duration of protection were assigned an evidence type of 1 and 2, respectively. In summary, the findings were that zoster vaccine live is effective in preventing herpes zoster and PHN, but effectiveness of the vaccine drops in the first year following vaccination and continues to wane year by year. No safety concerns of serious adverse events related to the vaccine were observed in real-world or clinical settings. Injection site reactions were more commonly reported among vaccine recipients, but tended to be mild. In conclusion, grade analyses were performed separately for the 2 existing herpes zoster vaccines, the herpes zoster subunit vaccine and zoster vaccine live. For both vaccines, the evidence types of critical outcomes is 1. In other words, we have high confidence in the estimates of effect of these outcomes for both vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very nice review. I think we'll move directly to the cost effectiveness analysis and then have discussion after that, if that's okay.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here to have the opportunity to share the results from our economic evaluation of vaccination to prevent herpes zoster and complications. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge our research team, which included collaborators from CDC and the University of Michigan, many of whom have been studying zoster immunization policy issues for many years. And this study represents research that we've been working on together for the last year and a half. I'd also like to recognize members of the work group who were instrumental in helping to develop the assumptions for this model as we developed it. We do not have any conflicts to report. So our overall study questions were to evaluate the cost effectiveness of herpes zoster subunit vaccine, or HZSU, compared with no vaccination using both healthcare and societal perspectives, to examine the cost effectiveness of revaccination with HZSU for individuals who had previously received zoster vaccine live, and to directly compare the cost effectiveness of HZSU and ZVL in the context of preferential recommendation. The intervention strategies that were included in the analysis were vaccination with HCSU, vaccination with ZVL, and no vaccination. The target population included 5 age groups as listed: 50 to 59, 60 to 69, 70 to 79, 80 through 89, and 90 through 99. The analytic time horizon was lifetime, that is, at age at vaccination until death. And for the base case, we modeled 100% adherence to the recommended 2-dose regimen for HCSU, consistent with CDC practice to evaluate a policy recommendation consistent with the recommended dosing schedule, but explored lower levels of 2-dose completion in the sensitivity analyses in detail. We use simulation modeling to project lifetime costs and health outcomes for each age group. The primary outcome measure for the model was the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, or ICER. Secondary outcomes included disaggregated costs, disaggregated health outcomes, including quality-adjusted life years gained, and numbers needed to vaccinate. The analysis used an annual cycle length. The costing year was 2016, and an annual discount rate of 3% was used. The model parameter inputs were based on published evidence, primary data, and supplemented by expert opinion for certain parameters for which data were not available. The next 2 slides that I'm going to go through show a simplified schematic of the simulation model. In the model, an individual can be vaccinated with HCSU, can be vaccinated with ZVL, or can remain unvaccinated. And we send individual cohorts through each of these different strategies in the model, so identical cohorts of simulated individuals. If vaccinated with HCSU, there is a probability that they will receive 2 doses of the vaccine or just 1 dose. This probability is set to 100% for the base case analysis, but relaxed in sensitivity and scenario analyses, which we'll present. Each year, an individual has some probability of remaining disease-free, experiencing zoster infection, or dying from other causes. If they experience zoster, they can have an uncomplicated zoster episode of less than 1 month, post-herpetic neuralgia or PHN, or other complications. There's a very small probability of dying from zoster infection. As simulated individuals travel through the model, they accumulate costs and losses in quality of life associated with each of the health states that they experience. And each probability cost and quality adjustment is represented by most likely value and a range of plausible parameter values. So these are coded into the model as distributions so that confidence intervals can be generated for each outcome in the model. Also included in the model, but not shown here, are adverse events associated with vaccination, including reactogenicity, systemic reactions, and severe adverse events. These events are also associated with costs and losses in quality of life, depending on the severity of the adverse event. In the next few slides, I'll briefly present the key parameter inputs into the model. So this slide shows the incidence for herpes zoster and postherpetic neuralgia, both of which increase with age. The incidence of herpes zoster ranges from 0.005 to 0.015, and PHN from 0.4 per 1,000 to 3.5 per 1,000. And the vertical lines depict the 95% confidence intervals used to define the parameter distributions for each of these in the model. This slide shows vaccine effectiveness for the 60 to 69-year cohort based on published data and various plausible assumptions for waning data. So the assumptions for vaccine effectiveness are based on the initial 4 years of data available from clinical trials and extrapolated over those. And then we've developed assumptions based on those data for different estimates of waning duration. For HCSU, it's close to 100% in the first year, assumed to wane over 19.4 years, extrapolating from the 4 years of data in the trials. For ZVL, vaccine effectiveness in the initial year is 78%, then drops consistent with published data and wanes over a period of 10 years. We also assume in the model some additional protection against PHN for ZVL. The 2 slides that I just flipped through provide details for the other age groups. I'll not present these in detail. For both vaccines, effectiveness is greater for the younger age groups and wanes more quickly for older age groups. The model also includes the following inputs: direct medical costs for zoster and PHN, productivity losses associated with lost productive time for paid and unpaid work due to illness, loss in quality of life as measured in quality-adjusted life years, vaccination-related costs, including dose costs, administration costs, time costs for vaccination, as well as costs and quality-adjusted life year losses associated with adverse events. So the primary outcome measure is the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, which divides the incremental cost of vaccination by the incremental quality-adjusted life years gained, comparing vaccination to no vaccination. And this metric measures the gain in health benefit associated with the additional investment in vaccination and accounts for offsets due to averted illness. We conducted analyses from both the healthcare and societal perspectives. The societal perspective is considered as the primary perspective for this analysis. We conducted a wide range of sensitivity analyses, and these will be presented in the context of the 3 policy questions being considered: recommendation of HCSU, consideration of revaccination for individuals that have previously received live zoster vaccine, and a preferential recommendation. Now moving on to the results. This table shows the projected cases of herpes zoster for both vaccines by age cohort. All of these results are shown for a cohort of 1,000 individuals in each age group. For 50 to 59, 265 cases of zoster would occur in the absence of vaccination, 186 if vaccinated with HCSU, yielding 79 cases, or 30% of total cases averted. Keep in mind that these are projected over the lifetime of the cohort, so that although incidence rates are higher for the older age groups, the period of analysis is shorter, so that yields different numbers of projected cases across the different age groups. This slide presents the data from the previous table in a figure. The total bar includes, including both the light blue and the dark blue, represents the total number of cases projected for each age group. The light blue represents cases averted. Dark blue represents remaining cases under vaccination. For all cohorts, HCSU is projected to avert a greater proportion of cases than ZVL. It's important to note that this does not directly represent the loss in quality-adjusted life years, because there's a higher proportion of PHN cases in the older age groups, and those are associated with a higher loss in quality-adjusted life years. This slide reports projected costs, both with and without vaccination. The total height of the bar represents total costs. The light blue portion represents vaccination costs, and the dark blue portion represents remaining disease-related costs for the vaccination strategies. For the 60 to 69 cohort in the upper left panel, I'll just walk through one of the panels. Disease-related costs are projected to be $474,000, again per 1,000 individual cohort, in the absence of vaccination. For HCSU, total costs are higher. Vaccination costs are approximately $350,000 in the light blue, with $244,000 in remaining disease costs, yielding a total of $594,000 in total costs. For ZVL, total costs after vaccination for the same age group are higher at $619,000. So from this figure, this tells us that vaccination requires an additional investment for all age groups. That is, total costs are higher under vaccination scenarios compared with no vaccination, and ZVL results in higher incremental costs than HCSU across all age groups. This table shows the incremental cost-effectiveness ratios in dollars per quality-adjusted life year by age group. Using base case assumptions, again, this is the most likely value for each of the parameters in the model. Cost-effectiveness ratios range from $47,000 per quality-adjusted life year to $10,000 per quality-adjusted life year for the most favorable age group. ZVL was dominated for all age groups evaluated, that is, live zoster vaccine as a vaccination strategy was overall more costly and yielded lower health gains when compared directly with HCSU. This table does not include the confidence intervals, which will be presented later in the uncertainty analysis. At the bottom of the slide, we represent a population level analysis which pools results across the age groups representing the proportion in each age group, and the overall cost-effectiveness ratio for a pooled cohort is $31,000 per quality-adjusted life year. Next, we'll evaluate how these results change in response to changes in the underlying parameter values and whether the results are robust to changes in these inputs. Okay. I'm going to take a minute to walk through this slide. So this tornado diagram displays the changes in the incremental cost-effectiveness ratios as we varied each parameter across the 95% confidence interval determined for the input assumptions. And so this diagram shows the top 10 parameters to which the results are most sensitive. So we conducted these univariate sensitivity analyses for every single parameter input into the model. The four most influential parameters are vaccine effectiveness, zoster and PHN incidence, and the cost of PHN. We created this slide before we knew for certain what the vaccine dose cost would be, so this is fixed at this point. Even under the lower bound assumptions for HCSU, so looking at the top bar in this figure, with initial 95% effectiveness and only 10-year duration, vaccination with HCSU remains below $100,000 per QALY. And then if we look more broadly across all the other sensitivity analyses represented here, below $50,000 per quality-adjusted life year for all of the univariate parameter changes. So overall, the results are robust to univariate changes in the parameter inputs. The next set of slides will show a scenario analysis to explore the cost-effectiveness of vaccinating individuals with HCSU who have already received ZVL. Okay. And I'm going to walk through how we derived vaccine effectiveness for this scenario. And we evaluated 3 intervals, 8 weeks, 1 year, and 5 years. For the 8-week interval, we modeled a scenario of immediate vaccination, since the cycle length in the model was 1 year. So this is a slightly more conservative assumption than an 8-week interval between the 2 vaccinations. So first, we consider the full vaccine effectiveness of ZVL as shown in the dotted line. Then, assuming the individual is revaccinated with HCSU at roughly the same time, or we can consider this to be approximately 8 weeks following vaccination with ZVL, and the full vaccine effectiveness associated with HCSU is shown in the solid line. For individuals that were revaccinated, we assume a linear relationship between VE and attributed the difference in VE between ZVL and HCSU as being attributable to a revaccinated individual, but with full vaccination cost. And this is depicted by the shaded area. For a 1-year interval, the dotted line for ZVL is shifted 1 year to the left, resulting in a larger shaded area or additional incremental protection for revaccination given a 1-year interval. For the 5-year interval, the dotted line is shifted 5 years to the left, again resulting in greater incremental effectiveness attributed to revaccination with HCSU. So using these input assumptions, the ICER for revaccination was highest for the 50 to 59-year cohort. Those are shown in the dark blue bars. And lowest for the 80 to 89-year cohort. So revaccination yielded incremental cost-effectiveness ratios lower than $60,000 per quality-adjusted life year gained for all age groups except for the 50 to 59-year cohort. The next few slides report a scenario analysis comparing both vaccination strategies directly to no vaccination instead of incrementally to each other. And we also compare our results to 3 other available analyses of zoster vaccination. Okay, this slide will represent a quick primer on the definition of dominance in economic evaluation. So this table shows the detailed outcomes for the 60 to 69 cohort In the third column, labeled costs, you can see that both HCSU and ZVL have higher total costs than no vaccination, and these have been placed in order of increase in costs. The incremental costs are then calculated to the next least expensive strategy, so $120,000 for comparing HCSU to no vaccination, and about $21,000 comparing ZVL incrementally to HCSU. And in comparing incremental QALYs are evaluated in the same way, and so it's clear from this slide that we can see that ZVL yields higher incremental costs but lower health gains as measured in QALYs, and this is what we would define as dominated in a cost-effectiveness analysis. It's important to keep in mind that each of the cost and quality-adjusted life year figures that are presented in this table are associated with a confidence interval that's not shown here. So we can also evaluate these results comparing both strategies directly to vaccination, and then a little bit later in the presentation we'll look at the confidence intervals around these. So this slide shows for the 60 to 69 year age group, if we compare, so again, this is the result that we've seen before, $26,000 per QALY for HCSU compared to no vaccination. Then in a scenario in which, say, HCSU were not available, we compared ZVL directly to no vaccination, the cost effectiveness ratio would be $55,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. Next, we'll consider our results in comparison to the three other existing economic analyses. This slide shows results from Lee and colleagues who provided an unpublished analysis that has results very concordant with the CDC Michigan model. Their results show $30,000 per QALY gained for HCSU and $67,000 per QALY gained when comparing ZVL directly to no vaccination. In their model, ZVL is also dominated by HCSU. In this next slide, we see a comparison to the GSK and Merck models. Both manufacturer models use an analytic perspective that includes direct medical costs and productivity losses, but does not include time cost of vaccination, which is why we've included on the slide both the societal perspective and the healthcare perspective. So the healthcare perspective includes only direct medical costs. The societal perspective includes in addition to that, productivity losses, as well as time cost for vaccination. The two other models fall in between those two perspectives because they include productivity losses, but they don't include time cost for vaccination. So comparing to the base case results for the GSK model, so they report more favorable incremental cost effectiveness ratios for HCSU and less favorable compared to the CDC model for ZVL. The Merck analysis presents scenarios in which ZVL is not dominated, but has similar results when we look at our results compared directly to vaccination. The Merck model yields less favorable results for HCSU. There are a number of differences across models, most importantly in assumptions for waning duration, for initial vaccine effectiveness for a single dose of HCSU, for quality-adjusted life year losses associated with PHN, modeling of adverse events, and two-dose completion rates. Again, in our model, we've assumed 100% two-dose completion rates. That is lower for both the GSK and the Merck models. Our model includes additional protection for ZVL against PHN, and that's not included in any of the other three models presented here. The next set of slides presenting the uncertainty analysis provides information relevant to the preferential recommendation question. In the probabilistic sensitivity analysis, and this is where 10,000 simulations are run using the parameter distributions in the model. In each run, a parameter value from that distribution is randomly drawn from from all of the parameter inputs in the model and simultaneously calculates a new cost effectiveness ratio. So we can therefore project a confidence interval for each of the base case cost effectiveness ratios. So what we can see here is that there is some overlap among the confidence intervals for the younger age groups, but not for the older age groups. And this indicates that there are some scenarios in which ZVL would be the preferred strategy in the younger age groups, but far less likely in the older age groups. When we relax the assumption of two-dose completion to 73.5%, and again, this has a distribution around it, the results are quite similar. Cost-effectiveness ratios are slightly lower for the younger age groups because our assumption for vaccine effectiveness for one dose at 90%, those individuals are receiving at 90% one dose for 10 years, but for only half the cost. Results are slightly in the opposite direction, slightly higher ICERs for 73% for the older age groups, because again, remember that the initial VE for one dose for those older age groups is much lower. This slide shows the cost-effectiveness acceptability curves, which provides information on the proportion of scenarios in which HCSU and ZVL will be the preferred strategy, depending on the willingness to pay threshold for a quality-adjusted life year. So after running 10,000 simulations, what we can see from these figures is that, so if we start in the top panel, if we look at $25,000 per quality-adjusted life year, so HCSU at a very low threshold, HCSU yields an ICER in about 50% of those simulations. In the other 50%, no vaccination would be preferred. At a willingness to pay threshold higher, $75,000 per quality adjusted life year and above, HCSU will become the preferred strategy in more than 90% of simulations, ZVL in fewer than 10%, and as we get higher, beyond 75 to 100%, ZVL is the preferred strategy in 4% of simulations or less. The curves look similar at 73.5% two-dose completion, again with slightly more favorable results for HCSU because of that assumption around one-dose vaccination of a higher VE with only half of the vaccination costs. This slide shows a scenario in which both initial VE and duration are set to the lower bounds for individuals that receive one dose of HCSU. The next two slides, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking through them because they're complicated multi-way sensitivity analyses. It's important to keep in mind that the probability of this combination of parameters is quite low in the number of simulations that we have done. So under two-dose completion rates as low as 20%, HCSU remains the preferred strategy and ZVL is dominated. And this is looking at lower bound for initial vaccine effectiveness as well as lower bound for waning duration for the one dose of vaccine. So this slide shows a multi-way sensitivity analyses, in a sense presenting the worst case and best case scenarios for vaccine effectiveness and waning duration for HCSU. So looking at the left-hand side of the slide, so this is the worst case scenario, lower bounds of initial VE for both one dose and two dose of HCSU, lower bounds for waning durations for both series completion. On the right-hand side, we look at the upper bound, so even higher initial VE for one dose of HCSU, longer waning duration for two doses of HCSU. Again, we're at the upper bound there, but the waning duration is longer. And we looked at these across 20, 50, and 100% completion rates. Again, to keep in mind that in our scenario analysis for lower two-dose completion, the base case was 73.5%. So this lower 20% bound is even outside of the 95% confidence interval that we've looked at for that. So this is really a worst case scenario. So to walk through this, so on the right-hand side, so start with the left-hand side. So under lower bound conditions, HCSU remains the preferred strategy under most variations in these parameters, but no longer dominates ZVL in two cases, for the 60 to 69 cohort under a 50% completion assumption and for 100% completion assumption. And what's happening here with this very high ratio of $569,000 per quality adjusted life year is that HCSU no longer dominates ZVL. So this is a ratio comparing HCSU incrementally to ZVL, which has a cost effectiveness ratio compared to no vaccination of 54,000. So this is very high because we're comparing it incrementally to ZVL. Looking at the right-hand side, so looking at the best case scenario, so upper bounds for both 1 dose of VE or 2 dose of VE, that in some of these scenarios that vaccination with HCSU becomes cost-saving and has much more favorable cost-effectiveness ratios. But important to keep in mind that if we look back to the cost-effectiveness acceptability curves, again, that these are the scenarios that are going to be represented, in the area within that 4% for ZVL and for the worst case, and upper bound above the 95% for HCSU. This is a simulation model, so there are a number of limitations in the available data, most notably for the incidence of adverse events associated with HCSU, and specifically with the healthcare utilization associated with these adverse events. Long-term duration of effectiveness for HCSU is not known beyond 4 years yet, and the proportion of individuals likely to complete the recommended 2-dose regimen is a question, as well as healthcare utilization associated with delivery of the second dose. In summary, the cost-effectiveness results varied by age, with HCSU preferred under most conditions and dominating ZVL in the base case analysis. Results were most sensitive to assumptions regarding the duration of vaccine effectiveness, incidence of HC and PHN, and the cost of illness. There were a number of differences across the models, including inclusion of time cost for vaccination, incidence of PHN, vaccine effectiveness, and the magnitude of QALY losses. Overall, the results are robust to most changes in the input parameters. So this is a brief summary of the economic evaluation, the end of the formal presentation, and look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I think we'll take questions and comments on this presentation at this time. Then Dr. Dooling will talk about considerations, and then we'll have a more general discussion. But questions on this presentation? Yes, go ahead.
I think this was part of the cost evaluation, but wasn't highlighted. But can I just check my data here?
Absolutely, yeah. We didn't have time to go into all the input parameters yet.
Okay. I think that the subunit vaccine is more effective at 1 dose than the live vaccine, less than 70 and greater than 70. Is that correct?
No, no, it's less effective, but it's more effective than half of 1 dose. So the assumption is, let me see if I can.
Because I thought that the data from the background data showed 90% effectiveness of 1 dose, and I know that's based on more limited data, for less than 70 and about 70% for 70 plus, which would be better.
Is it possible to pull up the supplementary slides? No. Are these up here? So actually, let me just go back to, I can do it with, oh, you have these, great, okay. Okay, so this slide shows what was assumed for 1 dose vaccine effectiveness. So comparing, so it's close to 100%, 96.6% for 2 doses of HCSU. But for 1 dose, Let's assume that they have 90% of the protection. Does that answer your question?
So I think those data compare favorably with the live vaccine, one dose, obviously, of the live vaccine. And there's no reason to think that the duration would be less, since actually duration is better with the subunits.
So we've
that right?
assumed a slightly lower duration compared with live Zoster vaccine, and they are similar, but they change slightly. Oh, it's not in there. But CVL has slightly different patterns across age groups.
Okay.
So, but they're similar to, so one dose of HCSU is similar to ZVL, but higher for that 50 to 69 age group. Because it starts at 78% for ZVL.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Grace, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I just wanted to comment. It's a combination of the initial effectiveness or efficacy and then the duration. So it's sort of like the area under the curve in a way. So agree that it looks a little bit similar, but the shorter duration for the one dose based on the anchor, even though that there was a distribution around that. Did I say that right, Lisa?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Oh, and I do have that slide. Actually, let me show it up here. So 2 doses shown in the top 2 panels and 1 dose in the bottom 2 panels.
Dr. Hunter.
Yeah, I've got 2 issues. One is I don't remember, maybe I was asleep during the last couple of meetings, but I don't remember being presented much data about one dose effectiveness. So I'm very concerned about the assumptions you're making there. The other is I'm still confused about the outcome of the assumptions of your sensitivity analysis on completion of the 2-dose series. There's a chart that made it look like that when the completion rate was lower, that ZVL compared more favorably in the cost analysis. But when I look at the graph with the crossing lines, it looks like at what I consider a fairly high completion rate of 75%, that HCSU compares more favorably. So I'm confused about that.
I'm glad you asked that question. So what in these 2 slides here, so this shows the one-way sensitivity analysis for 2-dose completion rates, because these do end up running in the opposite directions for the 50 to 69-year cohort compared to 70 and older. And that's because what's happening as we're moving from 100% 2-dose compliance to down to, in this slide, 20% compliance, that the assumption for 1 dose is that there's 90% effectiveness, but they're receiving, they only accrue half the dose costs and half the adverse event costs, whereas it moves in the other direction for the older age groups. But the overall implication of these 2 slides is that the cost effectiveness results are not particularly sensitive to this, to relaxing this assumption, which may seem surprising. What we don't see here is the change in the overall number of cases, because we have lower costs, lower vaccine effectiveness in the 1 dose, which yields a similar cost effectiveness ratio. But if we looked at the total number of cases prevented, it would be lower in these 20% completion scenarios compared to the 100%.
So let me see if I'm understanding, because I think now I'm a little less confused, is that your sensitivity analysis on completion rates is dependent upon your assumption of the 1-dose effectiveness, which we don't have very good data on.
That's correct. So when we model the completion rates, we have to include the reduced effectiveness for 1 dose.
Dr. Reingold.
Thank you for that lovely presentation. I have 2 quick questions. One is do we know anything about vaccine effectiveness with revaccination of people who've previously received the older Zoster vaccine, or is that entirely based on assumptions or immunogenicity data, or what do we actually know about effectiveness in that context? And then I have a separate question on your slide 32, but maybe you could answer that one first. Or somebody could answer it. I don't know if that would be.
I think Kathleen's going to answer that.
Yeah. You're going to answer that in the, do you want to take that one now? Or so, I mean, what I could say is that we don't have a direct data that we use to derive those vaccine effectiveness assumptions, but there are data that have looked at revaccination. Kathleen, if you want to.
And a revaccination was presented by the manufacturer in February ACIP meeting, I believe, and in a small study that included individuals who had been previously vaccinated with the live vaccine 5 years prior, didn't affect either the safety or the immunogenicity of the subunit vaccination.
Thank you. And then could you put up slide 32 again for a second?
32?
32, yeah. Could you just explain to me on the two right-hand columns, prod loss, does that basically assume that the Merck product disappears, or what does that refer to?
No. So what productivity losses are is that when an individual experiences an episode of Zoster or PHN, they miss time from work or they're unable to complete their daily activities, including household production. So we've assigned a cost to those losses, either work loss or unpaid household work. And so those are incorporated into the cost side of the model. And those are included across all of these analyses. The reason that I've clarified that there is because we've also included time costs for a fuller societal perspective, and those are not included in the two final models.
And so now that I understand that, the two right-hand columns are obviously quite different from some of the other columns, and I'm just curious, could you tell me what you think the two or three most important factors are that make such large differences between these models? I'm sure you said that, but could you remind me?
Yes, I'm happy to go through those. So for the GSK model, there were differences in vaccine effectiveness. So slightly more favorable in terms of duration for the GSK model for each CSU compared with ours or the other models. For the GSK model, they've made different assumptions around vaccine effectiveness for ZVL. For the Merck model, they've included scenarios that include much lower two-dose completion rates. They've also included higher vaccine effectiveness assumptions than are included for the ZVL vaccine than compared to the other models. And they also have included a much quicker waning rate compared to the other models for HCSU.
Dr. Szilagyi.
I had similar questions to the initial round of questions regarding revaccination, because I think the 75% may be ambitious, certainly for some populations, but I think I understand that even at lower vaccination rates, based on the assumptions that you had, that it, I think I follow the results now, but I do think that 75% is very optimistic.
Dr. Isinoli.
Just when you're on the slide 32, I still don't understand the difference between the GSK model and the Merck model. Why did different change there from the other ones? If you can, just between the GSK model.
Sure. And so there are a number of differences across the models. Let me pull up that one summary slide. Oh, no, so in the supplementary slide, so I'm just read through this table. So, it's number 36. So in any set of simulation models, there are always a number of differences in assumptions, which we would expect. And there are differences as well in the in the structure of the models, especially as the different models have modeled adverse event rates and healthcare utilization associated with those. But in terms of comparing kind of the key inputs in the model, so this is a comparison, it's a rough summary of differences between the CDC Michigan model compared with the GSK and Merck models. So looking at Zoster incidence, PHN incidence, slightly higher for GSK and Merck, but the incidence of PHN is slightly lower. This yields very similar overall incidence rates for our model compared with GSK. There's slightly lower incidence rates for the Merck model. Neither manufacturer model has included additional protection against PHN. Our quality-adjusted life year losses associated, especially with PHN, are higher based on directly on primary data collected in a study several years ago, specifically for Zoster. So that yields some differences within the models. But most importantly, it's around assumptions for vaccine effectiveness. So we have very similar assumptions for vaccine effectiveness for the initial 2-dose and 1-dose of HCSU. If we look at the Merck model, they've assumed a lower initial vaccine effectiveness for HCSU. They've also assumed a shorter waning duration for HCSU, as well as looking at ZVL. There are differences, major differences in those vaccine effectiveness assumptions. And the 2-dose compliance is different as well. So I'd say, but really what's driving the differences is primarily the assumptions around vaccine effectiveness. All of these other differences contribute partly to the differences in the model.
Okay, additional questions about this presentation? Dr. Lee.
I just want, just for a point of clarification, could you go back to the 1-dose slide 37?
37.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that we understood that this is a 1-dose lower bound. So that is something around the lines of 85% and 64%, depending on the age group, with the duration of immunity waning after 1 year. So that would be sort of the worst case scenario, because I do think that 1-dose question, there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And I think this is helpful just to have this information up there to understand that even in that scenario, and these, you know, there are other parameters that we understand, since this is not the probabilistic sensitivity analysis, this is just kind of a snapshot of the PSA, that at least this is, to me, helpful in understanding that even with a very short duration of immunity, that it's not so dissimilar from the overall findings in the PSA.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, you know, what this slide is showing us is that even under these kind of worst case assumptions, that the results are robust to changes in this input parameter.
In the back, at the microphone.
Hello, thank you. I'm Craig Roberts. I'm at Merck, and my team did the Merck model, so I'll make some comments on that.
Great.
And have some questions.
Terrific.
So one of the reasons there's a couple of reasons our analysis shows different results, particularly on the HCSU. One is it's 50% series completion rate, so it's not 100% like some of the others. And the other is we assume a rapid waning after the first dose of Shingrix. I don't believe there's that much difference in the 2-dose. I think it's largely driven by assuming less series completion and assuming much greater waning. And the second thing, and I'm actually going to turn this into a question for you, is when we look at the parameterization of Zostavax, the data that we feel represents most the real-world performance of Zostavax are the data that were presented at the June ACIP by Kaiser Permanente. And what they did is it's a study of, it includes 1.3 million individuals, 400,000 vaccinated, followed for up to 8 years at this point. And it shows pretty robust effectiveness in 60 to 69, 70 to 79, 80 to 89, and 90 and above, as well as durability. And we feel that those data are most representative of Zostavax performance in the real world. And there was some positive feedback at the June ACIP on that behalf. So one question I have is, have you seen those data, and were you able to include that scenario in your model? Because that plays a big role in particularly the older age groups in the Merck model.
Yes, thank you for that question. So those data were considered, and they're represented as part of the overall distribution in the modeling of the effectiveness for ZVL, but were not included as the base case, but are certainly included in the sensitivity analyses.
Yeah, and a second brief question is the understanding of this uncertainty. You know, the confidence intervals that you have, particularly in 50 to 59 and 60 to 69, span not only the point estimate of Zostavax, but the whole confidence interval of Zostavax. And there are a lot of assumptions in HCSU at this point that are pure unknowns, such as the series completion and the one dose effectiveness and durability. And I wonder if you could reflect on the interpretation of these confidence intervals with regard to policy.
Sure. So to clarify that there is some overlap in the confidence intervals for the younger age groups, but they're not completely overlapping. From a modeling perspective, it's not possible to really translate these into statistical significance, but it implies that for the older age groups that the cost effectiveness results are different for the older age groups. For the younger age groups, there is some overlap when we're running multiple simulations, and we see that in the cost effectiveness analyses. But again, at higher thresholds per quality adjusted life year, the number of scenarios in which that occur is 10 or 5% or less, depending on what threshold you're looking at.
Good morning, Paula Annunziato, clinical research at Merck. So I just wanted to follow up on one of the points that Dr. Roberts had just brought up with regards to the assumptions on zoster vaccine live durability in the CDC model. I was a member of the study team and a co-author on the shingles prevention study and long-term persistence studies, along with Ken Schmader, who is sitting here as well. And at the time that we published the results of the long-term prevention study, ACIP and CDC were actually somewhat critical of the study because of the limitations that we were very forthcoming about with regards to the lack of a concurrent control by which to estimate the actual effectiveness of the vaccine beyond the time period when the placebo recipients were offered vaccination. So because of that limitation, what we did was we created 3 different historical controls, trying the best we could to account for the fact that zoster incidence changes over years, irregardless of the age of the population. And we recognized that that was, clearly a limitation, but it was the best that we could do at the time. Another limitation of that study was that only a subset of the sites participated in it, and so we were able to enroll 6,800 subjects and had accrued about 25,000 person years. So from an effectiveness standpoint, that's a fairly small study. So I was surprised that the CDC chose that set of data as the input for their base case on durability for the vaccine, as opposed to the ongoing, very large and well-controlled effectiveness study that Kaiser is conducting that Dr. Roberts and you just mentioned. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that comment. So the assumptions used in the model incorporated data from several studies, including the shingles prevention study. It's consistent with the grade summary conducted as part of the zoster work group, and again, does incorporate as part of the sensitivity analysis the effectiveness rates from the study that you just described. And I'll invite my colleagues if they'd like to comment further on that particular presentation that we heard earlier this year.
Thank you.
Dr. Herpes.
Thank you. So you are absolutely correct that at the time that the Morrison paper was presented to the ACIP, which is the long-term prevention study, that we were quite critical because of the points that were just made, that there was a historic comparison group, plus the other biases in the study. At that time, historic rates of zoster in the general population had been increasing substantially for older adults for reasons that we still do not really understand. What has happened over the last number of years is that our best data from several different sources is that rates of zoster in the general population, in the older population, seem to have plateaued dramatically, and in a sense, actually, making the long-term persistence study perhaps even a conservative assessment, rather than, in other words, that it actually overstated the duration of the protection rather than understating it, if that indeed is the case. So that's regarding the long-term persistence study. I think we all agree that the Northern California study, observational study, was very well done. However, it was based on health-seeking behavior, and health-seeking behavior for zoster is complex. It also, for post-herpetic neuralgia, it was also based on health-seeking behavior, and that too is complex, and we have reason to be somewhat skeptical about some of the results from the different studies. And finally, in the long-term persistence study, one thing you can't say is that ascertainment was extremely good. You're looking for every single case in the study population. So based on those kinds of considerations, we felt that it was quite reasonable to consider the long-term persistence study to be the base case, and to include the other studies, including the Northern California study, to be within the sensitivity analyses.
I'd just like to reiterate at this point that the choice of using a randomized controlled trial, albeit a follow-on study, is consistent with that choice over an observational study, consistent with grade principles. We recognize there are limitations. That's why we use the observational studies in our sensitivity analyses, and that's.
Dr. Dooling, I think we can move on.
I could say good morning, ACIP members, liaison and ex officio members, and attendees. My name is Dr. Kathleen Dooling, and I will speak to you today about considerations for the use of herpes zoster vaccines. We'll start with a brief overview of herpes zoster and post-herpetic neuralgia epidemiology in the United States. The annual incidence is approximately 4 cases of herpes zoster per 1,000 population, or that's about 1 million cases per year annually. Incidence increases with age, ranging from 1 case per 1,000 in children to more than 15 cases per 1,000 population who are 80 years and older. For adults 50 years and older who have herpes zoster, 10 to 18% will go on to develop post-herpetic neuralgia. Similar to herpes zoster, the incidence increases with age. Zoster Vaccine Live, or Zostervax, hereafter referred to as ZVL, has been licensed in the US since 2006, and approximately 31% of individuals 60 and older report receipt of this vaccine. So herpes zoster, which is commonly known as shingles, is caused by reactivation of latent varicella zoster virus, resulting in a rash which is usually unilateral and involves 1 to 3 adjacent dermatomes. About 90% of herpes zoster episodes are associated with pain. Treatment with antivirals has been shown to reduce duration of rash as well as pain. Post-herpetic neuralgia, the most common complication of herpes zoster, is usually defined as pain which persists at least 90 days following the resolution of the rash. Unlike herpes zoster, the treatment has minimal or no efficacy and often results in side effects, especially in the elderly. We frequently receive emails from the public regarding herpes zoster and post-herpetic neuralgia, and here's an excerpt from one of them. My PHN is worse than my cancer and chemotherapy. It has made me depressed and suicidal in the past. The following are the key herpes zoster policy questions before the ACIP today. Question 1. Should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit vaccine for vaccination of immunocompetent adults 50 years and older? Question 2. Should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit vaccine for individuals who have previously been vaccinated with zoster vaccine live? Question 3. Finally, should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit be preferred over zoster vaccine live? In order to address, oh, the mic seems to have gone dead. There we go. In order to address these policy questions, the remainder of the presentation will go in the following format. First, I'll present the workgroup interpretation of the data, followed by the workgroup deliberations on the policy options, and finally, I'll present the workgroup perspective on the policy question. With respect to the first policy question, should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit vaccine for vaccination of immunocompetent adults age 50 years and older, the workgroup interpretation of the data was as follows. Based on one large phase 3 randomized controlled trial, which you heard about earlier, herpes zoster subunit vaccine demonstrated the following benefits. There was high vaccine efficacy against herpes zoster. It was 97% for participants 50 to 69 years old and 91% for participants 70 years and older. There was high vaccine efficacy against post-herpetic neuralgia, 91% for people 50 and older. Additionally, the vaccine maintained high efficacy at or above 85% for the 4 years following vaccination in participants 70 years and older. Based on the same randomized controlled trial, additional smaller studies, herpes zoster subunit vaccine demonstrated no differences between vaccinated and comparison populations for serious adverse events. However, grade 3 reactions were more commonly reported in the vaccinated group. That was 17% compared to 3% in the placebo group. In a small phase 3 study, in a small phase 2 study with subjects who were 60 years and older, immunogenicity data at 4, 6, and 9 years post-subunit vaccination demonstrated a CD4 positive T-cell response, which was maintained from year 4 through year 9 at greater than 3 times the baseline. And the immune response was maintained in the oldest age group, who was 70 years and older. However, there is no established correlate of protection. The number needed to vaccinate to prevent one case of herpes zoster varies by age and is from between 11 and 17 and from 70 and 187 to prevent one case of post-herpetic neuralgia. The incremental cost-effectiveness ratios from the societal perspective, comparing the subunit vaccination to no vaccine, range between $9,700 per QALY for people in their 80s to $47,000 per QALY for people in their 50s. This slide shows the health outcomes comparing herpes zoster subunit to no vaccine. There are 2 cohorts here consisting of 1 million vaccinees each, one in their 50s, one in their 60s. The health outcomes are measured over the lifespan. 100% of vaccine recipients completed the 2-dose series, and the effectiveness is assumed to wane to 0 in approximately 19 years. The first 2 columns represent the number of cases expected under no vaccination versus vaccination with herpes zoster subunit. The third column is the difference. In other words, the expected number of cases averted by vaccination over the lifespan. We expect between 80 and 87,000 averted cases of herpes zoster and between 5 and 10,000 averted cases of post-herpetic neuralgia. Therefore, between 11 and 13 people would need to be vaccinated in this age group to prevent one case of herpes zoster, and 187 to 100 would need to be vaccinated to prevent one case of post-herpetic neuralgia. Returning our focus to the first policy question, should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit for vaccination of immunocompetent people 50 years and older, the workgroup deliberations were as follows. Based on the review of the grade assessment and the evidence for critical and important outcomes, the herpes zoster workgroup felt strong that there was strong evidence that the vaccine is efficacious and durable, and found no evidence that it is unsafe. There's minimal waning in the first 4 years. Effectiveness beyond 4 years is uncertain. However, durability has been demonstrated for immunologic outcomes at both 6 and 9 years. The vaccine is reactogenic, resulting in 13% excess grade 3 reactions in vaccinees. There are approximately 42 million people 50 to 59 years old, and approximately 21% of all herpes zoster episodes actually occur in this age group. And under almost all assumptions, herpes zoster subunit demonstrates both a number needed to vaccinate as well as a cost effectiveness similar to or more favorable than other vaccines, other adult vaccines, for all age groups, including the 50 to 59-year-olds. Regarding the question, should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit for immunocompetent adults 50 years and older, the majority of work group members favor a policy which recommends subunit vaccination for immunocompetent adults. Question 2. Should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit for individuals previously vaccinated with zoster vaccine live? The workgroup interpretation of the data was as follows. Herpes zoster subunit vaccine is more efficacious than zoster vaccine live in all age categories. The differences are larger for older adults. Experimental and observational studies indicate significant waning of protection from zoster vaccine live. For example, the VE drops after the first year after receipt by approximately 15 to 25%. By 6 years post-vaccination, the VE is less than 35%, and there may be negligible protection by 10 years. The subunit vaccine is significantly more efficacious over 4 years, with a VE greater than 97% in the first year, which is maintained above 85% during the following 3 years. In a small study, vaccination with herpes zoster subunit 5 years following zoster vaccine live did not alter the safety or immunogenicity of the subunit vaccine. This graph depicts the duration of protection of herpes zoster vaccine live against herpes zoster by year following vaccination. The blue line illustrates the data from the phase 3 shingles prevention study that was discussed earlier, as well as the short-term and long-term persistence studies also discussed earlier. The other lines illustrate data from observational studies in individuals 60 and older. You can see a steep drop in the VE that following the first year after receipt. Thereafter, there's a slow waning observed. Studies agree that protection is less than 35% by 6 years following vaccination, and the longest duration study, again, which is the shingles prevention study followed by short-term and long-term persistence, estimates VE below 20% with a high degree of uncertainty. Now, this is a graph of the vaccine efficacy against herpes zoster for zoster vaccine live, as you saw in the previous graph, as well as herpes zoster subunit vaccine by year following vaccination. In red, you can see the VE for herpes zoster subunit from the ZOE phase 3 clinical trials. As you can see from this graph, there is a significant gap in the herpes zoster protection provided between both of these vaccines over the first 4 years. Approximately 20 million people have been vaccinated with zoster vaccine live and are potentially eligible for the subunit vaccine. Would be potentially eligible. Incremental cost effectiveness ratios from the societal perspective of revaccination, even at a minimal allowable interval of 8 weeks post zoster vaccine live, are similar to or lower than other adult vaccines, ranging from $15,000 per QALY for people in their 80s to $117,000 per QALY for people in their 50s. Regarding the question, should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit vaccine for individuals previously vaccinated with zoster vaccine live, the workgroup deliberations were as follows. The workgroup felt that prior zoster vaccine live receipt should not be a contraindication to receiving herpes zoster subunit vaccine. In fact, for prior zoster vaccine live recipients, herpes zoster subunit should be viewed as a new vaccine to prevent herpes zoster and its complications. Substantial burden of herpes zoster and PHN could be prevented by vaccinating this population with herpes zoster subunit vaccine, in particular among the elderly. Prior zoster vaccine live did not alter the safety or immunogenicity of herpes zoster as measured at a 5-year interval. However, we do not have efficacy data in this population, and there are no established correlates of protection. We don't have data on other intervals. It should be noted that 31% of the US population 60 years and older have actually followed ACIP advice and been vaccinated with zoster vaccine live, and a significant fraction of them now have very low protection from this disease. And finally, the work group held that the vaccination with the zoster subunit vaccine is a cost-effective strategy for individuals who have previously received zoster vaccine live. With respect to the question of should ACIP recommend herpes zoster subunit for individuals previously vaccinated with zoster vaccine live, the majority of workgroup members favor a policy recommending herpes zoster subunit vaccine for individuals previously vaccinated with zoster vaccine live. And now for the third and final policy question. Should ACIP recommend a preference for herpes zoster subunit over zoster vaccine live? It should be noted that when interpreting the data, these vaccines have not been studied in a head-to-head trial. In individual efficacy trials, herpes zoster subunit estimates are significantly higher than zoster vaccine live estimates across all age groups. For persons 60 to 69, herpes zoster subunit efficacy is estimated to be 97% versus 64% for zoster vaccine live. For people in their 70s, the estimated efficacy of herpes zoster subunit is more than double that for zoster vaccine live, and for people in their 80s, the estimated protection from the subunit vaccine is 5 times that estimated in clinical trials for zoster vaccine live. Herpes zoster subunit appears to wane at a slower rate than zoster vaccine live over the first 4 years. The number of expected cases of herpes zoster and post-herpetic neuralgia averted are far greater with the herpes zoster subunit than compared to zoster vaccine live. In terms of adverse effects, neither vaccine is associated with serious adverse events in immunocompetent persons. The subunit vaccine is more reactogenic than zoster vaccine live. Our economic analyses show that under almost all assumptions, the subunit vaccine leads to more disease prevention and decreased overall costs compared to zoster vaccine live. So this graph depicts the vaccine efficacy and effectiveness against herpes zoster for herpes zoster subunit vaccine as well as zoster vaccine live by age group during the first 4 years after vaccine administration. The horizontal axis is separated into 3 age categories. Efficacy for the subunit vaccine is depicted in the yellow bars, and efficacy for zoster vaccine live is depicted in the dark blue, and observational studies estimates of zoster vaccine live are in the lighter blue. As you can see, the subunit vaccine is more efficacious in each age category, and the difference is larger among older recipients. Similarly, this graph depicts vaccine efficacy and effectiveness against post-herpetic neuralgia for both herpes zoster and zoster vaccine live in adults 70 years and older during the first 4 years after receipt. As you can see, once again, the difference is substantial, but the uncertainty is greater. Let's return now to the cohort of 1 million people in their 60s. This slide presents health outcomes comparing no vaccine, zoster vaccine live, and herpes zoster subunit. Again, these are expected health outcomes measured over the lifespan. We have assumed that herpes zoster subunit recipients completed both 2 doses, and that the effectiveness wanes to 0 protection at 19 years, and that for zoster vaccine live, effectiveness wanes to 0 at 10 years. Under these assumptions, the differences in cases expected between the 2 vaccination strategies would result in an additional 53,000 herpes zoster cases averted and 4,000 cases of PHN averted in the herpes zoster subunit cohort. Let's take those same cohorts and look at disease averted under 2 examples of vaccine uptake. Under example number 1, 50% of the cohort received zoster vaccine live, and 50% received subunit vaccine. Under those circumstances, using the same assumptions, we'd expect 144,000 cases of herpes zoster and 23,000 cases of PHN. If instead the cohort was vaccinated with 10% with zoster vaccine live and 90% with herpes zoster subunit, we would expect approximately 122,000 cases of herpes zoster and 21,000 cases of post-herpetic neuralgia. Therefore, example 2 would result in an additional 21,000 cases of herpes zoster averted and 1,600 cases of post-herpetic neuralgia averted over the lifespan. The two policies under consideration by the work group were a preference for herpes zoster subunit or no preference for either vaccine. I'll now go through the pros and cons of each as deliberated by the work group. Under the preference for herpes zoster subunit option, the pros would be substantially more herpes zoster and post-herpetic neuralgia prevention as well as other complications. This is particularly important for the elderly who are also most vulnerable and at highest risk for both herpes zoster and post-herpetic neuralgia. The subunit vaccine is more cost-effective than zoster vaccine live under almost all circumstances. A preference would promote patient access to the more efficacious vaccine. The subunit vaccine is refrigerator stable, which may decrease some implementation barriers. Cons of a preferential recommendation are that the subunit vaccine may be removed from the market if an unexpected safety problem is observed. If effectiveness or long-term protection are substantially less than expected, ACIP will need to reverse the preferential recommendation. Next, this policy would lead to more grade 3 reactions following vaccination. It requires 2 doses, which would increase implementation barriers. In terms of the no preference policy, having 2 or more manufacturers of herpes zoster vaccines safeguard the vaccine supply. On the con side, a large difference in VE will result in thousands of preventable cases of herpes zoster and post-herpetic neuralgia over the lifespan. And finally, a non-preferential policy puts the onus on providers to compare the evidence and determine a vaccine choice. Ultimately, there are a number of unknowns in this decision analysis, many of which we've discussed already. We can think of these in terms of vaccine characteristics and programmatic implementation unknowns. First, there is always the possibility of an unexpected safety event with the herpes zoster subunit vaccine. The vaccine effectiveness of herpes zoster subunit beyond 4 years is unknown, and the VE and durability of 1 dose of herpes zoster are also unknown. Moreover, real-world adherence to the 2-dose schedule of the vaccine is unknown, as is healthcare seeking among recipients who experience reactions. A minority of the workgroup members thought that the unknowns regarding safety, effectiveness, and 2-dose adherence in the real-world setting preclude a preferential recommendation at this time. In discussion of the key unknowns, such as effectiveness and the possibility of a safety signal, the majority of the workgroup thought that, that adequate safety surveillance, pharmacovigilance, and long-term testing is in place to detect unexpected occurrences. ACIP will reevaluate the benefit to harm ratio if steep waning or a serious event were to occur. With respect to 2-dose adherence and 1-dose VE, provider and patient education regarding reactogenicity, expected reactogenicity, and the possibility may positively impact adherence, and observational studies will be required to estimate 1-dose VE. Ultimately, the majority of workgroup members thought a preferential recommendation for herpes zoster is likely to prevent significantly more disease compared to a non-preferential recommendation. Moreover, herpes zoster subunit vaccine is more cost-effective than zoster vaccine live under almost all assumptions. A non-preferential recommendation puts the onus on clinicians to compare safety and efficacy literature and select a vaccine. A preference would promote access to the more efficacious vaccine, whereas health systems or providers may choose to carry only the less expensive vaccine if no preference is stated. The workgroup acknowledged that although the preferential votes are uncommon for new vaccines, they are warranted when ACIP believes there is sufficient evidence of a superior evidence to harm ratio for one vaccine over another. Therefore, with respect to the question, should ACIP recommend a preference for herpes zoster subunit over zoster vaccine live, the majority of workgroup members favor a policy recommending a preference for herpes zoster subunit. I'll next go on to the votes that are being proposed. Vote number 1. Herpes zoster subunit vaccine is recommended for the prevention of herpes zoster and related complications for immunocompetent adults aged 50 years and older. Vote number 2. Herpes zoster subunit vaccine is recommended for the prevention of herpes zoster and related complications for immunocompetent adults who previously received zoster vaccine live. And vote number 3. Herpes zoster subunit vaccine is preferred over zoster vaccine live for the prevention of herpes zoster and its related complications.
Thank you, Dr. Dooling. I'd like to open the floor for discussion. I think what we're going to do in this session is have an overall discussion right now and then move to motions for each of the 3 considerations. And we will, before the first vote, include public comment and ask that all public comment be given at that time rather than having 3 separate public comments. But right now, let's have some discussion. Yes, Dr. Kemp.
Could we review the size, the amount of data available regarding safety and reactogenicity of revaccination? Because I feel like that data was a long time ago, and you mentioned there was a small study.
Sure. Okay, I don't have the slide that was presented at the previous ACIP meeting, but I can say that was a phase 2 study, and somebody who is more familiar with the actual number of participants in the study can perhaps speak to this. So they had 2 comparison groups, one that was vaccine naive and given herpes zoster subunit vaccine, and the other had been vaccinated 5 years previously with zoster vaccine alive. So the comparison between those 2 showed no difference in immunogenicity results following the administration of subunit vaccine in either group. There was also no difference in the reactogenicity or safety profile between the 2 groups.
Dr. Kalindris, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. Romulo Kalindris, Global Medical Affairs Lead for GSK Vaccine Zoster Program, also ex-CDC EIS officer, very excited to be here presenting back and representing a very large team at GSK and also all of the study investigators and researchers who have been developing this vaccine over the past 20 years. There were a little over 400 subjects in that revaccination study, and what it showed is that, as Kathleen mentioned, there were no differences in safety or reactogenicity between the group that had received Zostavax prior or not.
Thank you. Did you have a follow-up, Dr. Kemp?
Yeah, I guess that's the only part of this that bothers me a little bit, is this is a pretty small number. Can people who know more than I comment on our level of comfort with with recommending safety, safety or side effects for revaccination?
Dr. Belongia, you're next on the list anyway. Would you like to comment on that?
In terms of, the study just mentioned had a 5-year interval from previous Zostavax. And so, we don't know very much, but it's a live vaccine, and this is an adjuvanted subunit vaccine. There's no biological reason that I'm aware of to expect any interaction of those that might be harmful. The data are limited. It's a relatively small study, but there are some data on that. So I don't know if Rafael, if you have any additional comment or information on that.
No, I would concur with what you said, that biologically there's no reason to think that the 2 would interact in any particular way. And just the potential benefit for added disease averted was substantial enough that given what we know, where we are now, that it just made public health sense.
Yeah, so can I continue to my other point? So I just wanted to make sort of a couple points. These are really helpful presentations, I think, very clear, very helpful. But some of the comments that were brought up earlier sort of suggest that there may be some concerns about two-dose completion and, of course, the unknown efficacy of a single dose. But keep in mind the vaccine isn't licensed for a single dose, it's licensed for 2 doses. And I think we need to keep in mind that the vaccine efficacy and the waning trajectory are sort of fixed characteristics of the vaccine. It is what it is, and we can sort of model different assumptions, but it isn't going to change. However, implementation and 2-dose completion is not a fixed characteristic of the vaccine. And if it's not as high as we would like, we can take steps to make it higher. So that's sort of one point I wanted to make. And then the second point is that in terms of sort of additional sort of observational real-world data, we all would like to have that. But I think the reality is that over the next year or even 2 years, there isn't going to be that much more data available. And that in order to find really rare adverse events that potentially could be observed, it's going to take long-term studies in very large populations. And so you're really looking at several years. And you know, as was pointed out in your presentation, while we're waiting for that data to accrue, there will be you know, tens of thousands of zoster cases and thousands of PHN cases that will occur because of healthcare systems and insurers that continue to give a vaccine that is not performing at the level of this vaccine. So these are sort of considerations to keep in mind as we think about the 1-dose, unknown uncertainties on 1 dose, as well as the 2-dose completion rate.
Dr. Reingold.
You'll pardon me for asking an academic question, but I'm an academic. So in terms of the not having a correlate of protection and in the context of revaccination, I mean, I assume in the clinical trials people collected specimens and tried to look at that. So am I correct that the immunogenicity data are basically antibody data and that probably antibodies are not the relevant correlate of protection to look at?
So you're right, we don't have a correlate of protection. In the revaccination study, both cell-mediated immunity as well as antibody protection were both studied, and both showed no difference between the newly vaccinated group and the previously vaccinated group. In terms of overall assessment of a correlate of protection, we're anxiously awaiting that analysis. It is confounded somewhat by the paucity of cases in Zoe 50 and Zoe 70. So again, that information would be very helpful for decision making, I agree.
Dr. Ezinoli.
You know, I just always remember what happened a while ago when, as a pediatrician, I know how happy we all were when we got the live flu vaccine and what we had to make a decision on. Recently. And I keep wondering again, here we are, we have no head-to-head comparison of these two vaccines, and we have a vaccine that have no really serious side effects in terms of harm. And we're considering again to have a priority of one over the other, knowing exactly what will happen is that most likely the other vaccine will go away, and we're not going to have something to compare or to stand by if something happens. So I keep wondering if there is so much damage that can be done, and if from the last slide that shows that there are things in place to be able to monitor side effect, monitor effectiveness, that we won't be able to get the result faster than you had thought about, that in 2 years, or a year or two, we will have a little bit more data to confidently make a preference determination, and if there is a hurry to make that preference determination at this point.
Thank you. Dr. Romero.
So I just have, one quick comment, and maybe you can't answer it, but there was a paucity of minority populations in the licensing group. What steps have been taken to remedy that in the follow-up? Will we have a robust cadre of patients in those populations?
Dr. Friedland, would you like to comment?
Yes, Dr. Friedland from GSK Vaccines. GSK is committed in the post-licensure setting to generate effectiveness data in other populations who will be receiving this vaccine. And safety as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Stevens.
So can you give me a bit of a reminder or refresher on the reactogenicity issue, which is obviously significant with the subunit vaccine? Do we know a mechanism? One question, but has there been studies looking at whether that influences the one dose, the second dose, the individuals receiving the second dose? The second question, and is there any data on nonsteroidals or acetaminophen associated with administering co-administration?
So to make sure I have your questions correctly, the first question was about mechanisms of reactivation of varicella zoster virus. I apologize.
Mechanisms of reactogenicity of the vaccine. What is the underlying high reason for the high rates of reactogenicity? Is there any data on that?
The high rates of reactogenicity are thought to be associated with the adjuvant, which overall boosts the immune response to the antigen, which is anti-GE antibody, which is found on the cell surface of varicella zoster virus. And in terms of your second question around NSAIDs being associated with the treatment of...
No, co-administration of NSAIDs or acetaminophen, which is used in some reactogenicity vaccines, has that been looked at?
I'm not aware if that particular question has been studied.
Dr. Riley, you're next.
So this may already be well known, but do we have a sense of why only 30% of the population who's recommended for this vaccine is getting it? Because, you think that's with a one dose and only 30% of people are getting it. And now we're going to consider something that's 2 doses. Is that going to make it even worse? I mean, everything you're trying to do to benefit the population may not be beneficial. So that's just one question. And then the second one is more of a comment, which follows on to what Dr. Romero had to say. I mean, I believe I read that the incidence of herpes zoster is different in different ethnic populations where potentially African Americans have a lower incidence. So I just would echo that I would love to see the safety data as well, because it makes me think that there's something different about the immune system. And so hopefully that data will be generated.
Dr. Weinberg, do you want to comment on the implementation challenges?
Sure. Well, I think as we're all aware, there are challenges to implementation of all adult vaccines in the U.S., especially with herpes zoster vaccine. Given the storage and price of the vaccine, there are challenges for patients and providers to stock the vaccine and patients to access the vaccine. So although zoster vaccine coverage has been going up in the U.S. over the last several years, and this year it did reach 30%, which was our goal for healthy people.
Thank you. Dr.
Could I just add to that comment? Is that possible, just directly to that question?
Certainly.
Because we have a lot of so I'm Ed Bresnitz from MERT. There are a number of issues that, why the uptake is not great, but one of them obviously is the complex reimbursement scheme. And that really is probably one of the major reasons, because at least for the 65 and over population, this is a Medicare Part D benefit. It's not going to change for Shingrix either. In fact, it'll be problematic even more so because it's a 2-dose vaccine. So for example, most of the vaccine is given in the fall. That's what our data shows, along with concomitantly with flu or pneumovax. If they get it in the fall and they come back in the early part of the next year for the second dose, they may have full pay because they won't have met their deduction and out-of-pocket costs. That's the major reason why the uptake is probably not as great as it can be. Because people, when they find out that their cost is going to be over $50 at the pharmacy, they walk away.
Thank you. Dr. Sun?
Yes, thank you. So this is a sort of a general comment. Since this has been brought up a couple of times, Dr. Dooling's mentioned that the work group is confident that the pharmacovigilance plan will suffice in evaluating safety. So I was just wondering if the working group had a chance to look at the final pharmacovigilance plan, because in the review of vaccines, a lot of times the pharmacovigilance plan is not finalized till relatively late in the review cycle, and so they might be. And I just wonder if we had a chance to look at what is actually in our approval letter and what the plans is, because it does address certain safety issues that came up during the pre-licensure evaluation. And if not, then perhaps GSK can just summarize what that is.
We had a provisional presentation prior to licensure, but I would ask Dr. Sun that you speak to that, or GSK, who have more up-to-date information on what that pharmacovigilance plan will consist of.
Dr. Colindres?
Romulo Colindres, GSK Vaccines. Yes, we do have a detailed pharmacovigilance plan now, an outline of which has been shared with the ACIP members. And of course, we're very committed to the continued close monitoring of safety now as we're entering the post-marketing setting. So the pharmacovigilance plan is a sort of three-tiered plan. The first is routine pharmacovigilance, as we would do for any GSK licensed vaccine. This includes, safety signal detection. The second part would be enhanced pharmacovigilance. So this would be for any events of interest, and this would include exercises such as observed versus expected analyses. And then the third part, which is very specific, is a targeted safety study. So this has been agreed upon with regulatory authorities, and they've provided input into this. And this would be a large non-interventional prospective cohort study done in a large medical database system in which we would follow certain events of interest, potential immune-mediated diseases, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Walter?
Yeah, I had two questions. The first is a more general question and really has to do with the issue of when are people who get vaccinated, at what age are they getting vaccinated? When you're looking at in terms of different efficacy based on different ages, that's my first general question. And then the second question has to do with vote number 2 on the revaccination provision. Given that we only have data on a 5-year interval, did the working group put any thoughts to an interval in the recommendation?
So I'll answer the first question about rates of vaccination with Zoster vaccine live by age. So from National Health Interview study of self-report of vaccine receipt, we understand that in the entire population over 60, as of 2015, 31% report vaccine receipt. That is higher in the 60 to 69 and is lower in 70 plus. We have unpublished figures that the number 50 to 59 is somewhere in the 5 to 6% area. And then your follow-up question, could you repeat?
It's about timing in an interval, since the only data we have is 5-year data.
That's right. So the work group did discuss an interval and thought that the most straightforward recommendation would be to set a minimal allowable interval and then allow for CDC guidance to assist patients and providers to decide what might be an optimal interval. That minimal interval would be set at 8 weeks, but optimal interval would be guidance by such considerations as the age at which the person was vaccinated initially and the interval from which between when they got vaccinated and their presentation.
Thank you. I'm going to do one more comment question, Dr. Moore, and then I think it would be good to make a motion.
Great, thank you. I did want to address implementation issues since that is a part of my day job, is focusing on these issues. And one thing that does encourage me, the financial issue barrier is certainly a serious one. However, it may be that it's the barrier to initiation rather than being more difficult with 2 doses. If you're able to overcome the financial barrier to get 1, the second one will be easier based on figuring out how to access it potentially. The other thing that's encouraging about coverage with this 2-dose vaccine is that although initiation may occur in the fall with flu vaccination, the people in the age groups that are recommended to get this vaccine or could be recommended are ones who visit healthcare providers much more frequently, visit pharmacies much more frequently, and may have more opportunities to receive that second dose. And this disease, unlike hepatitis B or hepatitis A that may be a travel vaccine that they need a series of or something that they don't really see or feel that personally threatened by, zoster is something that everybody knows somebody who's had it, who's had a horrible experience with it. It's very visible, it's very painful, and it seems much more of an immediate threat that may motivate people in this age group in a way that we have not seen before for the vaccines that are available, because this really is a very different sort of vaccine and a different sort of disease than we've experienced before. And then I did want to make one other comment acknowledging Eche's comment about LAIV, and I also, explore those questions as you have. And what comes to my mind is influenza is a very different animal than anything else we tackle. It is wily, it changes all the time. There are many, many unknowns about it. And rather than trying to draw a correlation between an influenza product, which has so many issues that are unrelated to zoster, I want to deal with them separately with the evidence at hand. And certainly it's the role of the ACIP to address the evidence available to us and to make different changes to our recommendations if the evidence changes. But we have to address the data and the evidence before us, which is this vaccine performs in a very superior fashion and will prevent much more disease than the other product that's available. And it's up to us to figure out how to make sure that the public gets the 2 doses that they need.
Dr. Atmar.
Coming back to the second issue that we're going to vote on, were other subgroups, for example, persons who had prior zoster, considered by the work group, and specifically the paper by Godot, where there were 6 persons who got zoster within the year after receiving, out of 96 who had received this vaccine?
Yes. So in the revaccination study, individuals who had previously had previous zoster episode would have been excluded, and that was a true exclusion for the efficacy studies as well. So you're alluding to a phase 3 immunogenicity study in subjects 50 years and older with a prior history of herpes zoster. So that study was designed to look at immunogenicity endpoints as well as safety. And you're right, it met the immunogenicity endpoints. In other words, the subunit vaccine appeared to be elicit the same immunogenicity in people who had a prior zoster episode, and the reactogenicity was similar as people who had in a prior episode as people who had not. What was unexpected was that there were 6 participants reporting 9 suspected episodes of herpes zoster. Given the small number of expected herpes zoster cases, a priori, a rigorous case ascertainment procedure was not mandated in the protocol. 4 of the episodes were medically attended, and the remainder were self-reported. Interestingly, there's no laboratory confirmation and no photographs taken, which would have been the standard ascertainment in an efficacy trial, for example. All 9 cases were reported at Canadian sites and none in the Russian sites, which is also difficult to explain in this study. And another study is underway to assess herpes zoster recipients with a prior history of herpes zoster. For example, the individuals who received placebo in the efficacy trial and went on to get herpes zoster, several hundred have now been enrolled in the follow-on study. So we will hopefully have more clarity on this issue in time.
So was there any consideration to restricting the recommendation for vaccination to those who'd not previously had zoster?
At this time, the herpes zoster work group felt that there wasn't sufficient evidence to exclude individuals who had had a prior zoster episode, but those issues will be considered in guidance and further deliberated on before guidance is published.
Dr. Lee?
Thanks. I just wanted to make an overall comment because I think these decisions have been challenging to think through, and actually I very much appreciate Dr. Dooling's transparency about the pros and cons of these decisions because I agree with each of them, and that's what makes it so difficult. That said, I think our charge as a group is to be as transparent as possible in our decision making, to really focus on the benefit-risk balance at a population level, and in this instance, it's really helpful to have those cost-effectiveness analyses to kind of make that transparent. I think the challenge being that, it's always easy to look backwards in time and question whether or not we're making the right decision. But I agree with Dr. Moore that we have to make the best possible decision given the data we have at this moment. And it is actually just fine for our decision making to be dynamic, and it should be. As more data come in and as the uncertainty resolves, we should reconsider the decision at a future date. So that's my plea, to just hopefully have the members recognize that we may come up with different sort of judgments about where the data, our own values and judgments about how we want to make the decision, but hopefully as a group, regardless of maybe differences in opinion, that we will make the best possible decision on the whole.
Thank you. Dr. Duchin.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the past two comments by Drs. Lee and Moore about the prevalence and severity of this disease and the need to do the right thing by the patient. And in my role as a clinician, infectious disease specialist, and public health practitioner, I can't imagine not giving a preferential recommendation for the more effective vaccine based on the information that we've seen today about vaccine effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and safety. How would you explain to a patient that you're not advising them to use a vaccine that's expected to prevent a serious disease more effectively than another product? So I really encourage the members to make a preferential recommendation for this vaccine, and I will continue to make a preferential recommendation to my family, my friends, and my colleagues who ask.
Thank you. Ms. Pellegrini?
Thank you, and I'm so appreciating this vigorous conversation here and the ability to have the full discussion. So I'm trying to think about this from the layperson perspective, from those families and those patients. And one of the issues I keep coming back to is I can easily see someone coming to me and saying, wait, are you telling me that there's been a preferential recommendation even though this vaccine has never been administered outside of a research setting? And we can say, well, it's been tens of thousands of people and it's been a number of years, et cetera. And they'll say, but it's never been given outside a research setting. And that's what I'm really struggling with right now, is to say, we know there are a lot of unknowns. We know that there's a lot we have to learn over the next few years. I'm ending up in the place of being more comfortable starting with a straight recommendation and giving ourselves the ability to go to the preferential in a couple of years when we know more. But to me, to start out with a preferential recommendation, as great as this vaccine sounds right out of the gate, is just, it's really hard.
Thank you. Dr. Belongia?
I'd like to make a motion, but before I do that, I have one quick comment. Just also adding to the safety discussion, just to remind people that the Vaccine Safety Data Link will also be doing near real-time monitoring using pre-specified outcomes for this vaccine as it rolls out. Those typically run for a couple of years, so again, it's not something where you're going to have, really quick information, but there's an additional mechanism there. So having said that, I'd like to make a motion.
Can you wait 1 minute?
Yes.
Because I'd really like to give Dr. Brezhnitz the opportunity to
Certainly.
speak.
Dr. Baker has her hand up.
Sorry, I apologize. I think we failed to see it back here. Dr. Baker.
Well, I was trying not to speak, but I think there's just a couple of things. Ms. Pellegrino, I agree with what you're saying. Some of us have been here a long time, not longer than Dr. Plotkin, of course. And we assume that, first, I will recommend this vaccine for myself and my family members, okay? So I think it's a terrific addition. I'm thrilled there's a new vaccine that's being voted on today. Everything is all good with 1 and 2. But with regard to preferential, or even a new vaccine where there's not more than one manufacturer. Stuff happens in the real world. What if we have a preferential recommendation and there's a supply issue? Now, I hope not, and nobody's planning on it, but stuff happens. We were assured as pediatricians when PCV7 came out in the year 2000, there would be no supply issues. From the beginning, we could not use that vaccine in infants universally because there wasn't enough, and we had to keep using polysaccharide in children who were 2 and over. So I think the flu vaccine, the live flu vaccine, is a bad analogy for the reasons stated, but there could be supply issues. In the real world, there are marketplace issues when you have a preferential recommendation. The modeling, though lovely and transparent, what vaccine, even for babies, has adherence to a 2 or 3 dose schedule that's 100% out of the box? Or even now, especially in certain states where we're supposed to give 3 doses of DPT, and we don't manage to get that done until the child is a year or more of age in a good proportion of infants. So I think the comments about the real world and waiting to get more data outside of a clinical trial, if we can get ethnic diversity data, great. But this is a brand new adjuvant, and it looks great. And I'm not that worried biologically about the adjuvant, but it's a brand new adjuvant that has not been given to millions of people. So I make a comment about rare events, and I'm a person that tries not to worry about lack of data on rare events, but I just think great vaccine, both 1 and 2 should be straightforward. I am cautious about making a preferential recommendation, and I speak for the IDSA, not just for myself.
Thank you. Okay. I think I'm going to ask that we move to a motion after Dr. Brezhnit's comments, who's been waiting very patiently for a long time.
Dr. Freihaffer had some comments, but that's fine.
There will be additional opportunity for discussion after we make the motions.
So thank you for the opportunity. Now, I only get to make one set of comments despite 3 votes, so I get 9 minutes, right? Oh, okay. Just wanted to clarify.
No one will get a break if we don't move along.
So I'm Ed Bresnitz. I'm from Global Vaccine Medical Affairs at Merck. But just like you, I come to Merck, having had previous experiences as well, both in public health and as a practitioner. So those inform my comments as well, not just because I work for Merck. And I think we can all agree that the subunit vaccine deserves a recommendation. Congratulations to the GSK team for the great work they've done to this point. We've not said anything about that today, but I think that they really have done a great job getting to this point. And, we've had a terrific discussion this morning. I'm sure it'll go on as the morning goes on. Just a comment on the grade. Both vaccines were graded as type 1 evidence. I wish we could grade the inputs to the model, because if we had to do that, maybe we would get a 4, maybe even a 5 if it existed, because the evidence on those assumptions is very weak. But pre-licensure, there's clearly adequate data to make a recommendation, and I don't think I have to repeat the issues with having a preferential. I think Dr. Baker said them very well. But you have to make a vote. The work group has been split in their opinion, but the work group doesn't vote. It's the ACIP that votes, and clearly there are differences of opinion just listening to the conversation here. So there are 3 explicit votes that are going to come up, but there's an implicit vote as well, is that what will be your effective recommendation for Zostavax? Right now it's listed as a Category A recommendation, but for example, if you make a recommendation on revaccination without a time limit or the minimum time limit of 2 weeks, what does that actually say to the practitioner? Really? The cost-effective analyses, there were a million slides. I thank the ACIP for sharing them with us in advance. We had a lot of questions, as you know, very complex. But the bottom line is many of the analyses are based on assumptions that are based on assumptions. They're all projections of what might happen, assuming A, B, and C. And the base case assumptions were all favorable to basically the novel vaccine. And I'm not going to say unfavorable to Zostavax because we had real world data for that. Maybe not what we would have liked in the base case, but in any case, that was available to the work group as well. And you saw the presentations, extremely complex. This issue of making a preferential right now and then coming back in a year or two to reverse it if there are new data, that's a lot harder to do than basically making a neutral recommendation right now, an equivalent recommendation for both vaccines. At the last ACIP meeting, Kathleen Dooling actually put up there how long it would take to collect various pieces of data, and some of them for only 1 to 2 years. Series completion, for example, only is going to take you 1 to 2 years. That's relatively easy. Safety is a different issue. I don't really want to talk about safety. It's already been discussed. We agree with how that's going to move forward. But you could make a non-preferential recommendation, a non-differential recommendation, because 50 to 59, there wasn't a lot of data showed in the cost-effective analysis. The question is a policy recommendation for 50 and over. We don't have a recommendation for Zostavax for 60 and over. If you were going to make it for 50 and over, do that for Zostavax as well. So in conclusion, you can come back. You can have a neutral recommendation. You'll have data in a year or two. You already mentioned that you're going to be evaluating other issues where there may be additional votes. And I would say the best approach, based on my experience as a policymaker, is to be cautious about what your recommendation is. Votes have consequences, and occasionally they have unintended consequences as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Belongia, can we go with our motion for vote number 1?
I'd like to make a motion to approve vote number 1 recommendation.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. We'll say Dr. Moore made the second. Discussion. Okay. If there's no discussion, what I'd like to do is ask for public comment on all 3 together so that we can go through the public comment now ahead of any of the votes. Is there any public comment? Has anyone registered?
Nobody's registered. Well, we give it just a minute, and we will have further discussion on each vote, but from the public, we'd like to hear anybody who would like to speak at this point. If all of the ACIP members would please press the channel button on their voting thingamabob. I don't know what they're called. And see if the number 71 shows up at the top. Please tell me if that doesn't. And
you all may need to get your glasses out to read it, but.
Great.
Okay, so. Yeah, it's gone.
It's gone.
Gone.
It goes away.
It goes away. Okay, it's supposed to go away. Okay. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I think we'll go to the vote if we're ready.
So we're going to switch over to a different set of slides. We'll take you through this one very slowly, and we'll give you plenty of time. Just so you know, the last thing you press, we did go over this at a prior meeting, but the last, when we say the vote's opened, your vote will count, and then the last time you press the button is the vote that's counted, and we'll give you about a 5-second warning before the voting closes. And
to clarify.
Yeah.
This is your cheat sheet because A or 1 is yes, B no, C recuse, and D abstain.
So the voting
there it
is now open. You can vote. So Kelly and Peter and Nana will go through your votes, and then we'll put up the results of the other votes. Does that sound reasonable? So Peter?
Yes.
Kelly?
Yes.
Okay. Can we show the other 13? Okay. So
it appears that the first motion has passed to recommend HC subunit vaccine with 1 no vote and no recuse or abstain votes.
Do we want to show, can you please show us how people voted so we can make sure everyone voted correctly? So let's go around the room and get people's votes.
Okay, we'll go around once. Dr. Stevens, could you, there it goes. Oh, this is, yeah.
Stevens, yes.
Was that how you?
Walter, yes.
Szilagyi, yes.
Moore, yes.
Belongia, yes.
Lee, yes.
Atmore, yes.
Pellegrini, yes.
Etche, yes.
Hunter, yes.
Kemp, yes.
Reingold, yes.
Romero, yes.
Thank you. Dr. Riley, do you care to say anything about your no vote? No. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So now we'll move on to vote number 2. We have the wording up there, I hope, or not.
So I think,
Dr. Belongia, would you like to make the motion?
and can we just pull up the slides from the
Yes.
presentation, please? And we'll withhold from electronic voting for the rest of the session until we can get the last 3 fixed. And we'll bring it back maybe tomorrow. Thanks for bearing with us.
So I'll make a motion to approve the second vote for revaccination.
Is there a second?
Second.
Dr. Romero?
Second.
Discussion. Ms. Pellegrini?
I just have a question. Are we concerned if there is no interval that some clinicians might think they can give both vaccines at the same time?
I believe that well, actually, Dr. Belongia, why don't you answer that?
Sure. There was discussion on that, and the feeling was it was best to have the interval in the guidance rather than in the recommendation itself. And so, there's no recommended interval, but the minimum interval was somewhat arbitrarily decided to be 8 weeks. But recognizing that the vast majority of people out there who are going to be eligible for this are people who have been vaccinated 1, 2, 3, or more years in the past.
Or not vaccinated at all, since the rate is only about 30%. So, yes, Dr. Moore.
And I'll add to that, one of the considerations was that there are so many variable clinical considerations, depending on the age of the patient, that it would be unfair to try to set a recommendation that's fixed, but rather to provide more detailed guidance that would allow a clinician and patient to make a decision for an 85-year-old that may be very different than for a 55-year-old.
Other questions, comments? Anybody? Dr. Hunter?
Given all that, how is this different from a preferential vote?
Dr. Moore?
Well, it's quite clear that patients who received ZVL in the past, who have waning immunity and lack of protection against shingles and shingles complications. And so this vaccine is a completely different vaccine, which then enables them to receive protection against shingles that has waned. And there's no, so that was the reason for it.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, in some ways, this is kind of almost overkill in the sense that these really are different vaccines. So it's not really revaccination. It's the same disease, but different vaccines. But I think it's to clarify that point so that if someone has had ZVL in the past, they would be eligible. Dr. Walter?
I think I'm still struggling with that issue with the minimal interval the way it is at the short time point of, what was it, 2 months or something, so.
Yeah, if I could.
Remember, you're not voting on that. That will be in the background recommendations, but not in the formal recommendation.
But my point is that it is a preferential recommendation if you give it early. It's not if you give it late.
That's true.
Other discussion, Ms. Pellegrini.
The schedule will say that everyone of a certain age should get a Zoster vaccine, correct? And then it will say, if you got ZVL, you should be revaccinated. If we approve this.
No, I think what it will say is that if you're over 50, you can get HZSU. If you're over 60, you can get either.
Well, but to just clarify, with this recommendation in the vote, the schedule would then say if you've received ZVale in the past, you should get subunit vaccine. So there would be two separate parts of the schedule.
So shouldn't it then have an interval in the recommendation rather than just in the guidance?
Go ahead. I think the issue is that this is one of those that we're going to be collecting aggressive data on. And I think the feeling of the work group and of the CDC staff was that tying down to an interval would make it difficult to stay up with the data as the data continues to evolve. And I think this is, the ACIP statement is going to have information in there around what to do about the interval. But we've been trying to get the language of the actual recommendation more precise and not have so many caveats in it. And I think the complication is if you tried to put an interval in here, it would require multiple scenarios because there are so many different iterations. Regardless of what happens around this, the full ACIP statement comes to all of you. And what I would say is in that full ACIP statement, look in detail about this, but also that the public, the number of people who read the recommendation as precisely as you write it is probably smaller than the people who read the surrounding clinical guidance that comes from this. And, we'll be working with all the provider organizations and all of our partners to translate what you all say here, including people's concern about the interval, into clinical guidance for providers.
Dr. Freihofer? Dr. Reingold.
So just so I'm clear on this, it would seem to be not that difficult to put a minimum interval of 8 weeks into the recommendation, since it sounds like that's what we expect to be the case anyway in virtually anybody, right? So is there a reason not to say a minimal interval of 8 weeks in the recommendation itself and then have additional guidance for?
Dr. Lee?
Yes, I think that the reason is that the vote really should be based on what evidence exists, and there's not sufficient evidence about the 8-week interval. And so as that gets collected, I think that's where it should sit in the guidance as opposed to the recommendation. We should be really focusing on where the evidence is. And then I'll just say that this discussion about one size fits all, it's such a challenge when we're talking about over 50 because there's such heterogeneity in the populations that we actually tried to go down the path of could there be recommendations for 80 and over, and then 70 to 70. But then when you started to break it down, again, we didn't have the evidence to say it should be this interval or that interval. It was a lot of clinical judgment and a lot of expert opinion that we hope will go in the guidance around that.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Anybody? Okay, seeing none, I think we should move to the vote, and I'd like to start with Dr. Szilagyi. We're not using.
Just make sure everyone's aware. We're going to go back to around the table, and then in the breaks we'll work on the voting thingamabobs.
Szilagyi, yes.
Moore, yes.
Belongia, yes.
Lee, yes.
Atmore, yes.
Pellegrini, yes.
Zanolo, yes.
Hunter, no.
Camp, yes.
Reingold, yes.
Romero, yes.
Bennett, yes.
Stevens, yes.
Riley, no.
Walter, no.
Thank you. I believe that this motion passed with 2 negative votes. Three. Riley, Hunter, and Walter. Would anyone like to make any comment about their vote?
Yes, without an interval, this is a preferential vote.
I think we still have insufficient evidence for revaccinate or subsequent vaccination. I shouldn't say revaccination.
Thank you. Okay, on to motion number 3. Dr. Belongia.
I'll let someone else make the motion. I've done 2 already.
We have been leaning on you a little hard today. Would someone else like to make a motion?
I'll motion that.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Dr. Hunter and Dr. Ezeanolu.
I'm sorry, didn't you motioned no?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you made a
No,
motion.
I say I will motion, yes, we should vote on this issue.
Actually, let me read this. Oh, it is up. Okay, great. I want to be sure that everyone sees the wording because it's not exactly the way the wording was in the previous slide. So this is the correct wording for this motion. Okay, open for discussion. Dr. Freihofer.
Sandra Fryho for American College of Physicians and American Medical Association. I want to echo the comments of Ms. Pellegrini and Dr. Baker that this is a new adjuvant, that I think as a clinician, and that as I feel my role here, I see patients every day. When clinicians see recommendations from ACIP, they put a lot of trust and they really know that ACIP has looked at the data. And I do have concerns about making a preferential recommendation for a vaccine with an adjuvant that's never been out in the real world before. It does seem to me a little bit impulsive, and I would rather us be cautious and at least have it out there for a few months. But just to do that today when it's never been out there concerns me.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Dr. Moore.
Just briefly, in some of the way I was thinking about this, is it seems almost like, given the difference in performance in the clinical trials, it seems almost like a permissive recommendation equivalent to not express any sort of acknowledgement of the difference, the substantial difference in performance of these two vaccines. And my concern is that clinicians would look at that and say, well, why are you saying use either one, but the performance is so different? Just as they have concerns anytime we make a permissive pick one kind of recommendation, or you may use this if you wish. I feel like that's our responsibility, and they do look to us to make a recommendation based on the evidence in front of us. And the evidence in front of us across costs, across disease prevention, are very strong. Reasonable people can disagree about the concerns about the unknown and whether we're more comfortable making decisions based on the evidence in front of us and comfortable saying, as the evidence evolves, our recommendation should evolve, whereas others feel differently about those values and judgments, and reasonable people can disagree about this. I don't think we've never heard anyone, concern or not, express a feeling that they didn't believe that the subunit vaccine performed in a superior manner to the existing vaccine and would prevent more disease. And so as such, I think that we're all leaning in the same direction. Some want it out there longer for some indeterminate period of time to see if unknowns that haven't ever been considered show up, while others say, let's go forward with a preference and see how it's used. But I think it's reasonable to disagree. However, I think a preference is what is called upon here for my conscience to give people direction based on its performance.
Thank you. Dr. Kemp.
Yeah, just following up on Dr. Freihofer's comment, I guess I'm thinking of this as a completely new vaccine. And we consider lots of new vaccines, and I think we consider lots of new vaccines with a similar level of evidence, even though we're always a little worried about, is something going to be out there? I guess I'm not sure about the difference between this vaccine and lots of other vaccines we consider that are new.
Thank you. Ms. Pellegrini.
Again, just a question. Will the guidance include the discussion of the data on performance and?
The ACIP statement includes all of this. When we take that and translate it to clinical guidance, we try to follow not only the science, but also the intent of ACIP. And so that will all be there. I can say that some clinicians may look at that. Most clinicians will not look at it at the depth that you look at it, and so they will look for how we express a recommendation. Again, this language will be places, but there's a difference from what we would say if you all express a preferential recommendation than if you express than if you vote no on this, and it will come out sounding differently to clinicians. If you vote yes, we will say this. If you vote no, we will say there are 2 vaccines that are recommended for prevention of zoster, and we'll continue to gather evidence and come back to you all when and if there's more data.
Well, if we're willing to say that we trust the clinicians will go to the guidance for the interval, then I'm willing to trust that they'll go to the guidance for this kind of information as well.
Again, I want to be clear, the interval guidance will be proscriptive as opposed to the comparison of the differences of the vaccine. And so if you all decide that based on the discussions you have today, there's not a preference, our guidance will say something like, again, CDC recommends these vaccines, and will provide decision-making clinical guidance about what to do with individuals who got one than the other, but we wouldn't reflect in that clinical guidance, in a clinical trial, this vaccine looked like this versus this vaccine looked like that. So it will be there in the ACIP statement if people want to look at it, but the level of the discussion you're having, most clinicians won't get into that detail.
Dr. Belongia.
And just to expand on that, one of the concerns that was discussed in the work group is that, say, unlike prescribing an individual drug, and there are a lot of circumstances where physicians don't choose the specific vaccine. If a healthcare system is choosing to stock a vaccine and there's no recommendation, they may choose to stock the lowest priced vaccine for their bottom line. And basically refer to ACIP recommendations as, they're all equivalent from ACIP's perspective. And I do think, they aren't necessarily going to read through the literature to sort of second guess our decision on that. And similarly with insurers. And so the concern then was that I completely agree with in the concerns and the wish to have more real world data, but at the same time sort of balancing that against the fact that there will be cases of post-herpetic neuralgia and zoster that will occur in people who may not even know this vaccine exists and may not know that it's better and don't get it.
Dr. Hunter.
So I really appreciate all the work that the work group has done. This is a really difficult issue. I do think we already have basically 2 preferential votes that we just made. One was for the 50 to 60-year-olds, and one was for people who are already vaccinated who are less than, I don't know, pick your number, 4 years or whatever. So I think that it'll be clear to the clinicians and to health systems that for certain people there is a preference, and that may or may not never trust how administrators and insurance is going to work in the real world, but that does make me feel like that there's going to be some push to use the new vaccine in those groups.
Dr. Freihofer, did you have one more? No? Yes, no.
I do understand how wonderful this new vaccine is and its increased effectiveness, but I think you discount the clinicians when you think that if it's something is put in a first paragraph talking and comparing the differences, that they won't read that.
Thank you. Any further? Yes, Dr. Lee.
Just one thing for the record, for the guidance around this particular vote, I just wanted to reemphasize something that came up in our working group, which is that there are a greater number of grade 3 reactions, and that it's important for us to reflect that in the guidance to providers to make sure that they're providing that information to their patients, because it's not going to be probably anticipated by the average patient. They'll think it's like every other shot. So in addition to sort of the uncertainty around safety concerns in the guidance.
I think that's likely to be included, and it's particularly important in hoping to achieve better compliance with the second dose to warn people. Doctor?
Yeah, hi. I just want to say that this is a really complicated issue, and we frequently face with you all with things that are completely different than anything we've had to deal with before, and this is one of those cases. And regardless of what happens with this vote, I have to say that I don't actually know that we can predict what's going to happen with clinicians. So, Dr. Belanger, though I agree with you about stocking of vaccines, in fact, your second recommendation requires providers, in fact, to be able to stock new vaccine. And so I don't actually know what will happen, regardless of how you all will vote. On a very quick interval, we'll come back and let you know, because there are market forces that are going to impact this either way. And so I think you all could try to predict all the different scenarios. And, I mean, what we can promise you is that regardless of what happens, we'll be aggressive in all our different means of collecting real-world data about how the vaccine is used, as well as the adverse events and the efficacy and everything else we can.
Thank you. And on that note, I think we'll move to a vote. Could we start with Dr. Kemp?
Kemp, yes.
Hunter, no.
Ezanolu, no.
Pellegrini, no.
Atmar, no.
Lee, yes.
Belanger, yes.
Moore, yes.
Szilagyi, yes.
Walter, no.
Riley, no.
Stevens, yes.
Bennett, yes.
Romero, no.
Reingold, yes.
I've got bad news, folks. We have 8 yeses and 7 nos. So with that, the motion does pass, and that's certainly the closest vote in my experience with the ACIP. And I have to say that this discussion has been fantastic. I think this has really been very good, very transparent, very clear. But it's hard to have a divided committee.
I do want to just make sure that we did get the vote correctly, since we didn't have the vote.
Not that I said that.
But I do believe I did. I just because. So I have okay. So I have Kemp, yes. Hunter, no. Ache, no. Sorry, I'm not saying your last name. Pellegrini, no. Atmar, no. Gracely, yes. Belanger, yes. Moore, yes. Szilagyi was a yes. Walters was a no. Riley, no. Stevens, yes. Bennett, yes. Romero, no. Reingold, yes. Was that correct?
I think we know why the noes said no, but I think our procedure is now to give the noes opportunities to express their noes.
Yes, please, for the record, if anyone would like to say anything.
Yeah, I think most of my concerns were already expressed, longer-term safety concerns and also supply issues. So,
I don't think there's any harm done by waiting an additional year to get more information to make a preference statement. I don't think there was a harm that we could have prevented by saying let's wait a year. So I think we had an opportunity to have the 2 vaccines out there. Since we don't have a head-to-head comparison, maybe that will offer us some in about a year to come, and we can compare some of these things.
Thank you. Anyone else? Dr. Riley?
Also, I think it would be nice to see safety data on a larger population that is not just research-based, especially because we had very little data on ethnic minorities as well.
Thank you. Any other comments? Thank you all very, very much for this very interesting and difficult session. And we will break till 11:15. Thank you.